A single accusation from Queen Camilla was enough to shatter the silence of Buckingham Palace and send Catherine walking out the gates. But what exactly did Camilla say that forced the future queen to abandon everything in a storm of royal outrage? It was supposed to be a routine private briefing, a ceremonial debrief following a high-profile royal engagement that had captivated the press and public alike. The room, guarded by tradition and marble silence, had seen its fair share of royal disputes. But nothing like this. Without warning, Camilla's voice cut through the air like a blade. Her tone wasn't just stern, it was thunderous, shaking the composure of every soul in the room. Senior aides flinched. Even Charles, usually composed in such meetings, turned pale as Camilla leveled a chilling accusation. Catherine, she claimed, had deliberately undermined her, not just in the press, but within the very machinery of the monarchy. Accusations of disloyalty are nothing new in royal circles, but this was personal. Camilla alleged that Catherine had manipulated public appearances to cast herself as the true queen, a quiet campaign of charm, subtle defiance, and shadow alliances. The allegation hung heavy in the air, absurd and unproven, but it landed like a hammer blow. Rumors would later claim that Camilla had been tipped off fed intelligence from an unnamed courtier, confirming that Catherine had met privately with Princess Anne and even advisors close to the king. To Camilla, it wasn't a coincidence, it was a conspiracy. William stood frozen. His heart was torn in half by the impossible bind. As husband, he wanted to defend Catherine with the fury of a man watching his wife be humiliated in public. As heir, he understood the weight of protocol and restraint. But in his silence, Catherine saw everything she needed to. Her eyes didn't flash with anger, only disbelief. Humiliation didn't suit her. She stood up without saying a word, her face void of expression but her hands trembling ever so slightly. With measured steps, she walked toward the heavy wooden doors. No one dared stop her. Aides turned their eyes away, pretending to examine papers or shuffle folders. Even Charles said nothing. She walked straight out of the palace, past the main corridor, past the press office, past security who were too stunned to ask questions. By the time the palace realized what had happened, Catherine had vanished, leaving behind a trail of whispers, confusion, and dread. The news didn't leak immediately, but the atmosphere shifted. The press sensed it. Reporters began circling like sharks. Something was wrong, and everyone could feel it in the sudden change of tone coming from behind palace gates. The media buzzed with questions. Was there a scandal brewing? Has Catherine been ousted? Has a quiet war begun inside the monarchy? But to understand why this one moment caused a royal rupture, we must pull back the curtain and examine the history one laced with rivalry, resentment, and an unresolved battle for power. Long before the accusation, tension brewed between Camilla and Catherine. On the surface, cordial smiles. Behind the scenes, whispered warnings and power plays that only insiders dared speak about. Camilla had always struggled with her place in the monarchy. No matter how many titles were bestowed or how tightly she held Charles's arm in public, she remained a polarizing figure. The stain of the past Diana's shadow, public disapproval, the whispers of scandal never truly faded. And when Catherine entered the royal stage, elegant, poised, and met with thunderous public approval, that old insecurity deepened into something far more dangerous. What began as discomfort quickly festered into resentment. Catherine was everything Camilla wasn't. Adored, youthful, quietly commanding, and unburdened by scandal. While Camilla worked for decades to rehabilitate her image, Catherine seemed to glide effortlessly through the same corridors, embraced by the public as the rightful face of the monarchy's future. Catherine never played for power, yet power seemed to find her. Her presence at engagements drew more cameras. Her grace in public, measured, deliberate, and deeply rooted in emotional intelligence, created a contrast Camilla couldn't ignore. Charles, though careful, showed subtle signs of admiration. His offhand compliments during council meetings, his repeated trust in Catherine to represent the crown during critical global appearances, Camilla noticed. And she remembered. Every slight, every moment when Catherine received what she had long fought for the nation's respect felt like a wound reopening. Princess Anne, ever the sharp observer, stood silently through the unfolding rivalry. She saw the games, the posturing, and the unspoken strain behind every shared appearance. Anne had long respected Catherine's quiet resolve, and sensed that Camilla's grip on the family's internal hierarchy was slipping. At royal functions, the tension was visible to those trained to see it. A missed handshake here, an awkward glance during a balcony moment, a chair positioned just slightly off to disrupt a lineup. These were not accidents, these were messages. But the moment that altered everything came not in front of cameras, but beside a roaring fireplace at Sandringham. It was Christmas, and the family had gathered in private, no press, no advisors. Just blood and bone. In that intimate setting, Camilla allegedly cornered Catherine in a conversation that quickly turned personal. She questioned Catherine's loyalty, not to the crown, but to her. Words were exchanged in hushed, cutting tones. Camilla made it clear, Catherine was to remember her place. The conversation was never spoken of again publicly, but those who were there recall Catherine leaving the room early, eyes glassy, voice silent. From that night forward, something shifted. Catherine no longer deferred. She became more direct, less willing to play along with traditions that allowed unspoken hierarchies to dominate her role. And Camilla? She began to unravel, her insecurities no longer hidden behind protocol. The battle wasn't loud, but it was felt in every gesture, every cold glance across a crowded room. These tensions simmered for years, but one event made them boil over, triggering the moment Catherine could no longer hold her silence. The night before the accusation, something happened. A whispered exchange in the palace library. A hidden document. A hushed warning that perhaps Camilla had something to hide and something to protect. It was just past midnight, when murmurs of unusual movement crept through the west wing of Buckingham Palace. Most of the family had long since retired, and only a skeleton staff remained awake, attending to routine duties. But the Queen Consort was awake. Not reading, not pacing, she was meeting someone. Camilla had summoned her most trusted aide under the pretense of reviewing speech notes. But that wasn't what happened. For nearly 40 minutes, the library door remained shut, and the faint sound of whispers carried through the ancient air vents. According to one staffer, who later risked everything to speak anonymously, the voices weren't merely discussing matters of state, they were plotting something. The contents of their meeting remained sealed in silence, but what emerged afterward left a trail too telling to ignore. A confidential document, previously thought to be stored securely in the royal archives, was suddenly intercepted by palace intelligence. It bore no official letterhead but carried the weight of something far more significant. Those who saw it say it contained references to a sovereign realignment and an internal succession clause. Terms so inflammatory they were immediately buried, never to reach the king's desk. But not before whispers began circulating among the staff. Whatever was in that paper, it wasn't meant to protect the monarchy. It was meant to protect someone inside it. And then came the warning. Catherine, quietly dining in her private quarters, received a message from Anne. Not a phone call, not a text. A handwritten note slipped discreetly into her room by a longtime footman loyal to Anne. 3 words scrawled in a hurried pen. Be careful tomorrow. That was it. No explanation. No context. Just a quiet alert from someone who rarely spoke in riddles. Catherine didn't ask questions. She understood. Meanwhile, a subtle but deliberate shift in palace security confirmed that something unspoken was unfolding. Officers usually assigned to routine watch were repositioned. Access to certain corridors was suddenly restricted. Guards typically stationed near the public-facing halls were reassigned to internal doors. And Camilla? She moved through the halls with an eerie calm, yet always trailed by an extra pair of eyes. Even Charles asked questions, but received only vague reassurances from those around her. By dawn, the royal media pool had been given an embargoed briefing, an unusual move reserved only for moments of high importance. The alert hinted at a palace statement forthcoming, accompanied by non-specific language around clarifying future roles within the royal family. To the trained eye, this was code. Something seismic was about to unfold, and it wasn't just a reshuffling of appearances or titles. It was power being moved behind the scenes. As the morning broke and the household stirred, the air was different. Courtiers exchanged anxious glances. Advisors double-checked speaking notes, although no speeches had been scheduled. And Catherine, typically serene and unbothered by royal theatrics, moved with quiet intensity. She knew They all knew. Something had been set in motion. What came next wasn't just a confrontation, it was a carefully staged ambush with one goal: to bring Catherine to her knees. In a voice laced with bitterness, Camilla accused Catherine of something so severe. Even the king froze in disbelief. And for Catherine, it wasn't just an insult. It was a betrayal that couldn't be ignored. The air in the private chamber was still, almost reverent, until Camilla shattered it with words no one expected, not even the staff who had been carefully choreographing the day's optics. She stood, trembling not from fear, but fury, and pointed directly at Catherine. Her accusation rang out with such force, it silenced the entire room. Camilla alleged that Catherine, in collaboration with Princess Anne and Prince William, had orchestrated a plan to sideline her. She called it a coordinated effort to marginalize her influence within the monarchy and reorient the public image of the crown away from her and toward Catherine. It was a calculated betrayal, she claimed, and one that struck at the heart of her authority as queen consort. The words weren't just shocking, they were dangerous. Camilla didn't stop there. She claimed Catherine had accessed confidential royal files, documents intended only for the eyes of the king and his closest circle. Files that outlined succession contingencies, personal correspondences, and internal deliberations on future roles within the monarchy. The implication was clear: Catherine had crossed a line, and Anne and William were complicit. Camilla's voice cracked mid-sentence as she demanded that Catherine step down from public duties, at least temporarily, while a full inquiry was conducted. Her tone was brittle but venomous, like someone who had waited too long to erupt and no longer cared about collateral damage. King Charles, typically composed even in the tensest of family meetings, sat frozen in place. He looked between his wife and his daughter-in-law, eyes wide, breath shallow. This wasn't palace gossip. This was a public scandal waiting to explode. He attempted to interject, to restore some sense of order, but his words faltered. No one was listening. The air had shifted. Trust, that fragile currency of monarchy, had just evaporated. And still, Catherine said nothing. Her silence cut deeper than any defense. She didn't plead, didn't correct, didn't explain. Instead, she looked directly at Camilla, not with anger, but with sorrow. Then she stood. Her chair scraped softly against the floor as she turned and walked toward the door, her dignity intact, her expression unreadable. Gasps filled the room, but she didn't flinch. Not even when William called out her name. His voice cracked with desperation, caught between duty and devotion. He wanted to follow her, but couldn't move. Not yet. His hesitation said everything. The moment was seismic. In one sweep, Catherine exited not just the room, but the very center of royal power. And as her footsteps echoed down the corridor, everyone knew something had changed forever. The balance of the royal family had shifted, and the palace would never feel the same again. But as the palace tried to contain the fallout, the media had already picked up the scent, and Catherine's absence only fueled the firestorm. Hours passed. No word from Catherine, no sightings. But what leaked to the press changed everything, and forced Buckingham Palace into full-blown damage control. By mid-afternoon, whispers turned into headlines. A few sharp-eyed reporters stationed outside the palace noticed an unmarked vehicle leaving from a rarely used side gate, swift, discreet, and oddly timed. Within minutes, the speculation began. Has Catherine been forced out? Read the first wave of tweets. Soon after, anonymous sources from within the palace began feeding fragments of a deeply fractured narrative to favored journalists. One source hinted at a royal confrontation. Another claimed it was a private family matter. But no one could explain Catherine's silence or her vanishing act. Then came the audio. A brief clip, poorly recorded but unmistakably real, leaked through a known royal gossip blog. Muffled voices, raised tones, the sound of something heavy, possibly porcelain shattering in the background. A single, anguished voice could be heard saying, "How could you accuse me of this?" It was enough to ignite a firestorm. The timing was damning. The silence from the palace? Deafening. Within hours, "Where is Catherine?" and "Camilla lead" were trending across social media. A storm had erupted far beyond the palace walls. Royal aides, typically experts in composure, descended into panic mode. Drafts of official statements were prepared and trashed just as quickly. Nothing sounded right. Nothing sounded believable. And through it all, Catherine remained unreachable. Every known royal residence, every secure location under the monarchy's control was checked. No sign. Even her closest staff, those who had served her loyally for years, were left in the dark. That silence, that calculated withdrawal, made her absence feel deliberate and powerful. Camilla, once again, found herself at the center of a media hurricane. Only this time, she wasn't the misunderstood wife fighting for acceptance. She was the antagonist, the one whose name was now tied to the disappearance of Britain's most beloved future queen. Her team scrambled to flip the narrative, leaking stories of concern, suggesting Catherine had simply needed a short break for rest. But no one bought it. The damage had already been done. The public had chosen its side. And it wasn't with Camilla. Cameras swarmed the gates of Kensington Palace. Helicopters hovered over Norfolk estates. Former royal aides were interviewed on talk shows, hinting at years of tension finally boiling over. Yet Catherine offered no rebuttal, no clarification, nothing. It was that very silence that amplified the mystery. It didn't feel like a retreat, it felt like a strategy. And that terrified the palace more than anything else. But Catherine wasn't gone. She had gone somewhere specific, somewhere safe. And who she met next would change the narrative completely. While chaos engulfed the palace, Catherine found refuge in the one royal who had always stood by her, Princess Anne. But even Anne had secrets, and one of them might explain Camilla's outburst. As the media descended on London and Buckingham Palace scrambled to regain control of the narrative, Catherine was already far from the noise. She had been seen, not by paparazzi or courtiers, but by a few sharp-eyed locals near the outskirts of Gatcombe Park, quietly arriving under discreet security escort. No flashy motorcade, no statement. Just Catherine, choosing the one person in the royal family who had never treated her as a threat, Anne. For years, their bond had remained largely private, built on mutual respect, not theatrics. And now, it would prove to be Catherine's most vital lifeline. Inside the estate, away from the echoes of accusation and betrayal, Anne received her not with questions, but protection. Her first words were simple, "You don't owe anyone silence." But her next ones carried weight. "You can't go back yet." Anne knew the palace machine better than most. She'd seen how it turned on its own when threatened. And she understood that this wasn't just about family anymore, it was about legacy, position, and buried truths finally clawing their way to the surface. Anne had more than advice to offer. She handed Catherine a sealed envelope, aged, yellowing at the edges, but unmistakably marked with the private insignia of Queen Elizabeth II. It was one of the late monarch's personal correspondences, never intended for public release. Its existence had been quietly protected by Anne for years. And now, with the monarchy teetering on the edge of a public implosion, she believed the time had come. As Catherine read, her hands trembled not from fear, but revelation. Inside were words that confirmed what Anne had long hinted at. The Queen had always envisioned a greater role for Catherine, one not merely of ceremonial grace, but of true leadership. Elizabeth had seen in Catherine what the world did: a quiet power, a stabilizing force, a bridge between tradition and modernity. And she had written as much in her own hand. The letter made no mention of Camilla. But its implications were clear. Catherine was the future the Queen believed in. Anne then shared her own burden in a conversation she'd held with her mother in the Queen's final months. A conversation that had revealed Elizabeth's growing concern about the fracture lines forming within the royal family. She had expressed doubts, not about Charles, but about the people surrounding him. She worried that power would once again fall into the wrong hands, not out of malice, but fear. Fear that her wishes would be ignored. That the path she had prepared for Catherine would be blocked by someone desperate to hold on to their own crown. And now, Anne said plainly what Catherine had already begun to suspect, Camilla knows, and she's afraid. As the sun rose over London, the palace awoke to its worst nightmare. Catherine was ready to speak, and she wouldn't be coming back quietly. In a message that shook the monarchy, Catherine released a statement elegant, firm, and piercing. She didn't name names, but the implications were devastating. After days of speculation, silence, and frantic palace maneuvering, Catherine finally spoke. Not through a press conference, not through a palace spokesperson, but in her own words, crafted with surgical precision and released through official channels at dawn. The statement was brief, but every line struck with the weight of thunder. She began with a sentence that sent shockwaves across the kingdom. "There comes a time when silence becomes complicity." From that moment, there was no turning back. Catherine's gloves were off, and though she never pointed fingers, the message was clear: there had been betrayal from within. She described a monarchy shaken by broken trust and shadows cast not by the public, but by those meant to protect the institution from within. It wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. Each phrase implied a knowledge of what had been said behind closed doors. She hinted at the existence of truth buried beneath tradition, referencing words penned in honor and locked away in fear, an unmistakable nod to the late Queen's secret letter now in her possession. Though she never cited the document by name, those inside the palace knew exactly what she meant. And for Camilla, it was a direct blow. Catherine stated she would be taking time for clarity and peace, but emphasized she remained devoted to the principles the crown was meant to uphold: honor, humility, and service. It was more than a retreat. It was a moral high ground, claimed without theatrics but with undeniable force. The public response was instant and electric. Within hours, "Stand with Catherine" trended worldwide. Images of her alongside the late Queen resurfaced online. Commentators praised her dignity. Even critics began to question what had really happened inside the palace, and all eyes turned toward Camilla. Inside the royal walls, the silence was shattered by chaos. Senior officials scrambled to craft a unified response, but cracks appeared instantly. Some urged reconciliation. Others demanded Catherine be reprimanded for breaking rank. The royal household, long known for its control, was unraveling from the inside. Whispers of succession discussions began surfacing, unthinkable just a week earlier. And Camilla? She was seen leaving Buckingham Palace late that evening, alone and visibly shaken. No public appearance. No statement. Just silence and speculation. Catherine had done what no one expected. She hadn't defended herself with anger. She hadn't retaliated with names. She had simply stood tall, spoken the truth as she knew it, and walked back into the public's heart with more power than any title could offer. Her words echoed far beyond the palace gates, not as a royal rebuke but as a challenge, a declaration that something within the monarchy was broken, and she was no longer willing to pretend it wasn't. And while the royals scrambled to maintain unity, a storm was forming behind closed doors, one that could shift the line of succession forever. For Prince William, loyalty to his wife meant war with the throne. But silence meant losing her forever. The crown or Catherine, he couldn't have both. Inside the walls of Buckingham Palace, the temperature had shifted from cold control to quiet combustion. William, once the image of royal discipline, now walked the halls with a storm behind his eyes. He had held back for days, hoping the institution would correct itself, hoping someone, his father, the palace advisors, the crown would rise to the moment and make it right. But the silence was deafening. The damage was growing, and Catherine remained away, not as a victim, but as a statement of everything broken at the heart of the monarchy. William had no choice left. He confronted his father behind closed doors, but there was no tact in his voice this time. "I will not stand by while she's attacked," he said, voice trembling with fury and heartbreak. "Not by outsiders, and not by this family." Charles, weary and cornered, pleaded for unity. He begged his son to see the bigger picture, to think of stability, the public, the legacy of the crown. But William, standing in that moment as both a prince and a husband, saw only one thing: the failure to protect the woman who had stood beside him through everything. Still, Charles refused to hold Camilla accountable. He insisted that disciplining the queen consort would tear the family further apart. What he didn't realize was that the fracture had already happened, and the refusal to address it was only deepening the wound. And then Anne stepped in. Until now, she had remained behind the scenes, guiding, advising, shielding. But when she stood beside William, her words were sharper than any press statement. "You either protect her, or you lose us both." Her voice was steady, unshaken. The crown wasn't meant to stand on personal bias, and if the monarchy had forgotten that, then perhaps it didn't deserve Catherine at all. In quiet protest, William began pulling back from key duties. 2 high-profile public appearances were abruptly cancelled without explanation. Behind closed doors, aides whispered of a growing crisis, one that could tip into constitutional chaos. Speculation began to rise that William was considering stepping away from several royal roles indefinitely. Not out of rebellion, but out of principle. His absence from public view became a statement louder than words. If the monarchy couldn't defend its own moral compass, then he would no longer prop it up. Every decision in that moment came at a cost. The pressure was unrelenting. The world was watching. Catherine's return, and with it the fragile hope of unity, now depended on one thing: a single act of reckoning, an acknowledgement not whispered or buried, but spoken aloud that she had been wronged. And that truth mattered more than image. And just when it seemed all hope for resolution was lost, one final revelation sealed Camilla's fate and left the palace stunned into silence. Sealed and hidden for years, the Queen's private letter was finally unveiled. And in just a few lines, it exposed the truth about who should lead and who had betrayed that legacy. The moment the letter surfaced, everything changed. Not just the conversation, not just the power dynamic, but the very soul of the monarchy. Stored carefully by Princess Anne, who had sworn to protect it until the moment demanded its light, this letter had remained untouched in a locked drawer inside a cedar-lined box, tucked away from the grasp of those who might twist its meaning. And now, with the family in turmoil and public trust hanging by a thread, Anne unsealed it. Its contents weren't long, but they were thunderous. Penned by Queen Elizabeth II in the final months of her reign, the letter laid out more than sentimental reflections. It laid down her vision. In it, she wrote of the changing world, the responsibility of the monarchy to evolve, and the future she believed could uphold its legacy with integrity. The Queen named Catherine not as a suggestion, not as a preference, but as her chosen successor to carry the role of Queen-in-Waiting. Not through blood, but through character. She described Catherine as a bridge between tradition and tomorrow, someone who inspired calm in chaos and dignity in the face of relentless scrutiny. Elizabeth didn't just approve of Catherine, she entrusted her with the future. But the letter held more than endorsement. It carried a warning. In her own hand, Elizabeth wrote of ego that poisons the crown and titles used as shields for personal gain. While she never named Camilla directly, the implications were undeniable. The Queen had seen the power struggles growing around her. She had felt the undertones of resistance and ambition from those who had once merely whispered in corners. And she had hoped this letter would guide Charles, privately, toward a path of unity, not division. Except he never saw it. The letter, addressed to the king, never reached his hands. And now, the palace knows why. After a quiet investigation initiated by Anne, palace archivists discovered documents hidden in an unmarked folder among them, fragments of correspondence that revealed an attempt to suppress the Queen's final wishes. One file stood out. Notes from a former aide close to Camilla indicated that the letter had been intercepted, dismissed as emotionally driven, and quietly buried. No royal order, no official record, just deliberate silence. Now exposed, the truth could no longer be contained. The royal family was forced into a reckoning. Advisors were divided. Legal counsel was brought in. And behind closed doors, once powerful voices were suddenly silenced. For many within the institution, it became impossible to deny what had long been whispered: Catherine was never meant to be sidelined. She was meant to lead. The letter became more than a document. It became a reckoning, an indictment of pride, a revival of purpose, and it shattered the illusion that the current order was unshakable. As Catherine prepares to return, not as a passive royal, but as the future leader the Queen always envisioned, one question lingers in the air. Will Camilla ever recover from the fallout? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.